2002. He has had a lifetime of involvement in politics, dating back to the early 1980s when he was campaign manager for Ballot when he was running. Not only in the early 80s, but also in the 1990s when we had two re-election campaigns. We also assisted with those campaigns. He was Bart Gordon's chief of staff here in Tennessee when Bart Gordon was in Washington. And I just learned last Friday that when our own Bob Clement ran for Congress, that our board was kind enough to loan Mr. Syler out to Bob Clement to help in his campaign. In addition to that, he is in charge of the special projects coordinator for Energy Achievement Outdoor Research Center. He's a political columnist that's frequently been quoted in the Tennessean and the national news media. And he also serves as a political analyst for WSNV TV, Channel News 4, and National. So we're looking forward to his opinion and his idea of how this campaign has in many ways been very different than what we've experienced in the past. Dr. Stumb has a series of questions to ask, and we'll be a town hall format. So we're anxious to hear what he has to say. And let's say welcome to Mr. Untitled, Dr. Ballot.
Thank you, Rusty, and thank those few of you who are here in the audience. This has been the most unusual year. We've had a number of events just like this, where we've had folks, prominent folks, such as Mr. Syler up here on the stage, and so few in the audience. But we know that a lot of folks are watching via the live stream and will watch this later via recording. So we're very appreciative of you taking your time and being with us today.
Well, thank you. I'm very, very happy to be here, and it's always fun to come talk politics. So, that's all right.
This is a particularly fun year, and I've got a series of questions that I'm going to pose to you.
All right. Well, I'm ready.
We'll start with this one because we're on a college campus. And by the way, for those of you who aren't aware, Mr. Syler told me he had been on our campus before on several occasions in this very room, which has a lot of interesting historical significance. But this first question pertains to college students and their perception. A recent report published in USA Today just last week on the 19th of October described how college students struggle to spot misinformation online as the 2020 election approaches. What advice would you give to college students, many of whom are probably voting for the very first time, to help them decipher conflicting campaign ads and conflicting information that they see about these upcoming elections?
Yeah, I think a lot of us have that problem, and before I address that, let me talk a little bit about what you said about this being a very important part of Congressman Bart Gordon's career. And so, yeah, I've spent quite a bit of time in this room. Members of Congress have the honor of nominating people to the service academies. And Lebanon was always a very central part of our district. And so we would have it here. And we would have all the students and the families in this room. And then our committee would have them being interviewed in some of the other rooms around. And then we would announce at the end in this room who got the nomination. So that was important. And we also had a couple of really big political rallies here. We had House Speaker Jim Wright right out on the front steps, former Congressman Claude Pepper of Florida. So we did a lot of different things. And then they mentioned that I did manage Bob Clement's race, and Bob was the first thing Bob Clement was the first job I ever had in politics. In 1978, when he was running for governor, I was his sound truck driver. So I would drive all over the state in a van with speakers on it. And so Bob and I became friends. When he was president here, I would come over and we'd play tennis. And then when he was running, he wanted to run for Congress, and he asked me to run the race, and I said, yeah, I'll be happy to do it. And he had just stepped down to being president to run, and the president gets one of those portraits made.
Right.
And so we were driving over And I was working. He said, "Can you drive me? I got to get my photograph made so I can have my portrait made in Cumberland." And so we get to wherever we were going, and I didn't like Bob's tie. And I said, "Bob, let's change ties." And so that's my tie.
So your tie is in his portrait?
My tie is in his portrait. Yeah, that's my tie.
That's great to know.
So,
you know, Bob is still a great friend of this institution and was here last Friday. He and Mary and their daughter Elizabeth and several of his grandchildren were here on our campus just last week, and we love Bob Clement. Thank you for your help with him.
yeah, he loved this university, and he always say, you know, I don't know why I'd go from a job where they call me Mr. President to congressman, but he made a great congressman.
He sure did.
And so back to that question, yeah, I think figuring out what's true and what's not true is incredibly tough today. I tell my students, you know, the great thing about living when you do, there's more information out there than ever before. The bad thing is there's more misinformation out there than ever before. And, you know, when you're seeing political ads or any other kind of commentary on politics or articles about politics, you've got to be very suspect, especially a negative political ad. The lion's share of them simply aren't true. And part of the real problem is that there are fewer and fewer journalists. So when I was working in politics, we made negative ads. I mean, we would get into races and we would have to have a negative ad. I knew, though, that the day after I brought that ad up, some reporter was going to call me, and the burden of proof was going to be on me to explain why that is true. Now it's like playing a football game with no officials. You know, there's nobody officiating it, and people get away with a lot. So you got to be suspect. You got to check a lot of sources.
There's an old expression that I've always liked about negative ads, and the expression is, "He who throws dirt loses ground."
Yeah.
And I've always felt that way. I really believe our current governor, Bill Lee, was able to be elected because he didn't do that. He chose not to adopt that strategy. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, Bill Lee ran an incredible race, and Governor Lee was the recipient of some luck and some good strategy because he got outspent amazingly by three candidates. And what happened was they all got into a battle among themselves of negative ads. And then when it finally came time to go after him, he started moving. I called it, and I've used it in class a bunch of times. It was an anti-negative negative. And the ad went something like, these negative ads are so, and what I've found is, and now they're saying all this about me, and what I've said is these ads tell you a lot more about the people running it than it does the people they're targeted at, the person they're targeted at. And it was a biting ad, but it was judged to be fair by voters, and it was well done.
Certainly seemed to be effective.
It was.
So, as we look forward to this election, which is next week, it's ongoing now, obviously, a lot of early voting, and we'll come back to that, but how would you compare the current 2020 presidential campaign to the 2016 race? How would you compare and contrast those two?
Yeah, 16, and that's the big question over who ends up winning this. 16 was a tougher year, I think, for the Democratic Party because they were, it was an open seat, but they had held the presidency for 8 years and tried to get a third term, in essence, which is always difficult. Re-elections, when you've got somebody eligible for re-elections, are largely a referendum on the incumbent. That's the way they are. The Trump campaign, since the convention, has been trying to change it from a referendum election to a choice election. Not, are you happy with President Donald Trump, but which one would you rather have? Joe Biden or Donald Trump? President Trump has made that somewhat difficult because it is kind of against his very nature to be able to change the subject from himself. I mean, he's had great success doing that, but sometimes it gets problematic. And so he's done a really much better job since the last debate. If you look at the rallies and what he's been doing the last few days, he's done a much better job of kind of making this a choice. So, and it's hard to tell who people are mad at now. And we'll just, it's one of the things that was up in the air.
A lot of people are mad at a lot of other people.
Yeah.
That's like everybody's mad.
Yeah.
So 4 years ago, at essentially this point in time in the campaign, just a week or 2 weeks before the election in 2016, most of the polls were predicting that Hillary Clinton was going to win and beat Donald Trump. Do you believe that the polls this year are any better or more accurate at predicting the outcome? And the second part of that question is, to what extent do polls actually influence voter behavior?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and what the entire election and what happens a week from today kind of hinges on that. The pollsters say that they have figured it out. The pollsters say that they've gotten it together. But kind of what we found 4 years ago is, I will argue, because I was watching them every day, that they weren't quite as bad as we think they are now. Because, so the battleground states, Clinton had a narrow lead, and that's what you've got to watch. It's all about the Electoral College. Clinton had a fairly narrow lead. She had a good one, and then it started moving. Trump started coming up. Then she stabilized, and then James Comey, about 10 days out, started that investigation, and that's when it really became a little squirrely. Her national lead was 3 points, 4 points, and I think she won by 2, roughly, around 3 million votes. So, yes, most of them got it wrong, because a lot of these, like Pennsylvania and others, maybe had it at 4. They had, in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, they had it at roughly 4 or 5%, and they ended up losing. And it's, can be in that area, especially in Pennsylvania. Yeah, so it's so that they say they've got it right. We'll figure that out. Now, the second part of that question is really interesting, because, does polling report voter preferences, or does it influence voter preferences? So, they mentioned that part of my job is at the Albert Gore Research Center at MTSU. And Albert Gore Sr. was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from 38 to 52, senator from 52 to 70. In 1960, and this is my research, I got into all these boxes. But what's that? That's right, yeah, thank you, yes, that's right, he is. And an MTSU alum, yeah, so got them both covered. So in 1960, Gore is very active with John F. Kennedy's campaign. And Kennedy's behind the polling, and Gore has always kind of distrusted polling. He thinks it leads voters and doesn't, he thinks it influences, not reports. So he gets into this running debate with Elmo Roper and George Gallup, and the pioneers of political polling. And we've got I sit down and read the original letters. And he starts accusing them of these things. And they start this back and forth. And one thing he gets into is the 1948 election, read the Dewey defeats Truman newspaper. He gets into that. And here's what is really interesting, and I think may apply to this race. Elmo Roper writes back that the reason they blew it in 48 was because they had developed their practice of polling during FDR's time, and that FDR, it didn't move. You either loved him or you hated him, and that they would quit polling in August or September because there was no reason to go. They didn't know that voters could actually vacillate. So with Truman in 48, they quit polling in September. There were a couple of independent candidates that collapsed, and that support went to Truman. And so they finally figured out you got to poll till election day. But here's where, here's where it kind of gets interesting for me with President Trump. A year ago today, President Trump's numbers in the Real Clear Politics poll of polls, where they average about 10 polls, he was at 43%. Today, he's at 43%. And he went up a point or so when the Democrats impeached him after he was acquitted. But that was maybe about 44 and a half. So it's been just incredibly stable. So I don't know if that is a pretense of how this is going to turn out, but I think generally, I told you to go a long answer on polling, but you asked me about polling, you're going to get a long explanation. But I think it does, in a large extent, give us an idea of what's going on. Is it perfect? No. And there's Congressman Lincoln Davis, who became a really good friend of ours. Lincoln ran against Congressman Gordon in the primary, against Bart, in that open seat primary in '84. And there was a guy at Channel 4 named Paul Keckley. He was an MTSU professor, and he did polling. He did a poll right before the election, everybody voted on election day then, that showed Lincoln like in third or fourth, fifth place. Well, Lincoln ended up in second place. And if Lincoln were in the room today, and I'd say, Lincoln, why did you lose that '84 race? He would say, it's that Keckley poll.
Because he was
it looked like he didn't have a chance. And he ended up a strong second.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll know hopefully soon.
Yeah,
whether the voters were right.
That's right.
I want to shift gears for a minute now. A lot of the political pundits today are suggesting, and you see this on the news all the time, that this election, this presidential election, people are saying, is the most important presidential election in our lifetime. Now, I guess we've heard that in the past as well, but we're certainly hearing it right now. But from your perspective, do you think that this particular race is really the most important election in our lifetime?
It's an important election. It's hard to tell what the stakes are, but obviously, President Trump's put a third of the Supreme Court judges on the court in the last 4 years, and so elections obviously have consequences, and I think people understand that, and I think it goes back to the strong feelings people have either for or against President Trump. There is a lot of, one of the things that I think has worn everyone out is the amount of drama, and what we're talking about here when they set hype in the drama. The media has to have 24-hour-a-day cable news, has to have something going on both sides. So we get everything is like earth-shattering and whatever, and then everything, every day, President Trump does something that is absolutely, there's drama. He creates drama, and then the media loves the drama. So I think everyone is somewhat worn out, and with so much of that. And I don't know how that impacts the election, but this one is important. It's hard to tell. We never know exactly how much.
So a question that it's not on my list here, but you piqued my interest on this. First off, the state of Tennessee historically has been a very poor state from a voter turnout, even a voter registration perspective. I think I've seen numbers that say we're maybe 47th out of 50 in terms of voter registration, and maybe 49th out of 50 in terms of actual voter turnout. Mm-hmm. And that's particularly true with the younger people, it seems. Can you comment on that phenomenon, and why you think, the young people, is it because they're burnt out on all, you get the news media just it's so much in the news, or do they really not care?
It's young people have always been a tough demographic. I mean, 20 years ago, if we were working trying to turn out voters, that would not have been a priority because you kind of know that the turnout there is going to be somewhat low. I think this time it is probably better, and the students can probably tell me more. But I sense a lot more interest, and I've done some thinking and commenting on or analysis of why Tennessee's been low in the last few years. I think part of it, when you look at a lot of the races they look at, the Democratic Party has been so uncompetitive in statewide races, other than the Bredesen Blackburn, and then Dean and Lee races. It's been a fairly uncompetitive party the last. No, they turned it. No, we thought they would be, but they ended up not competitive at all. So I think that suppresses turnout some. So.
That makes sense. I'm just curious, have you done any sort of informal polls of your students to see, are they voting? Are they going to vote? Or?
Well, yes. I've got, of course, mostly political, I've got all political science students. Some of them are in American government politics and are in a variety of things.
So
I hope, certainly my upper division students who are, one of my classes is on the presidential, we're following the swing states, following the toss-up House and Senate races, and then the other is campaign management. So those two, I hope they seem to be ready to vote.
That's good. So my next question has to do with undecided voters. The media, of course, focuses heavily on undecided voters, those potential swing voters in this highly polarized election. In your view, are there really any truly undecided voters at this point?
There are very few, and especially because of the polarization and there. But in a close race, but if you look at 16, President Trump won the race by getting a margin of cumulatively of 90,000 votes from Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He won those three states by combined. So a few late deciders can do that. Yeah, a lot of times undecided voters. Saturday Night Live did a great piece on this years ago. A lot of times late, when they get down to that 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% undecided, a lot of those are also low information voters who a lot of times don't end up showing up. So
there's another great quote by H.L. Mencken. Mencken purportedly said that democracy is the pathetic belief in the collective wisdom of individual ignorance. It does seem like we largely have an uninformed voter populace. Even with the media today, we have a lot of people that vote in a very uninformed fashion.
On both sides. A lot of people, a lot of people just look at the party label and go. And that's not the way to do it. And I try to tell my students that, I tell them the first day of class, I'm part of Democratic politics. That's the way I learned what I do. But my job here is not to indoctrinate you. You're going to, I'm a moderate. I understand that there's good and bad in both parties. And if you think your party is perfect, you're wrong. So you got to look at the candidates. You got to, do those things.
I think that's great advice. I'm really pleased to hear you're sharing that with your students. And with all of our students today. Thank you for that. So, in your estimation, Mr. Syler, what have both of the presidential campaigns this cycle done well and done not so well?
I think the Trump I mentioned earlier that I didn't think the president's campaign, and mostly the president, had done a good enough job of making this a choice between kind of think of it like this. Somebody does a poll of, do you like broccoli? A referendum on broccoli.
George Bush would mention that.
Yeah, George Bush, that's right, because it's very good. Yeah, so if it's a referendum on broccoli, broccoli's probably going to lose. But if it's a choice between broccoli and cauliflower, broccoli's got a fighting chance. So that's what the president needed to do, is to make this a choice between broccoli and cauliflower, not a referendum on broccoli. Now, he's done a little with the fracking comments and stuff, he's done a little bit better with that the last few days. I think that, the Biden campaign, I think their media has been extremely good. They haven't necessarily fallen into that trap that Hillary Clinton fell into, of just running personal attacks on Trump. He's in Georgia today. Should you be in Georgia today and not trying to make absolutely sure that you're going to win Pennsylvania, because it may all hinge on Pennsylvania.
Really?
If Biden loses Pennsylvania, it starts to get very, very dicey. So, but overall, both of them have run, pretty effective races.
Very interesting. I love your broccoli versus cauliflower analogy. That's good. Can you talk a little bit about the debates? We only had 2 this year, the presidential debates, and the first one was very contentious. A lot of people thought it was very ugly. And the second one, I think maybe perhaps because of the mute button, was at least a little more civil. But can you talk about the debates and, how effective they were maybe in changing the minds of any voters, and also, the role that both of the candidates played in the debates and how they did?
Yeah, I think the first debate was a mess. It was it's been called a lot of different things, some of which I can't say here. But it was almost a Super Bowl-sized crowd, and so people were paying attention. And while both candidates contributed to what happened, I think President Trump got a disproportionate, not necessarily unfairly, but he's the president, so he's going to get more judgment. He got a disproportionate level of the blame, and I think it really hurt him. You look at the polling for a few days; it was pretty hard on him. Now, the second one was obviously, as you said, much better. The president did much better. And a lot of it, too, is expectations in debates. The first debate, everyone expected the president to kind of, mop up the vice president. So expectations were there. Expectations were high for him. Second debate, that bar was pretty low. And he more than exceeded it. So
do you think that President Trump won the second debate?
I think he probably, the polling afterwards said that the majority of it, they picked Biden. But I've noticed a lot of that over the years, and a lot of times I can tell you more about the election than the debate. But I think because of expectations, because of purely expectations, I think he helped himself probably more than Biden helped himself in the long term.
Let's shift gears for a minute to early voting. This year, early voting turnout, which we have here in the state of Tennessee, and I know not every state even has the ability to early vote, it's my understanding, but maybe
most of them do now, but it's not, in some places, I think Maryland has just started a couple of days ago, so they're different. Voting is a state-by-state operation.
Yeah. Well, in the state of Tennessee, early voter turnout has been significant, I'm told. And here in Wilson County, as of last week, we've had more than 60% of the total votes cast in 2016 were already cast this year via early voting. And that early voting continues through Thursday of this week. So, number one, to what do you attribute this large turnout? And what do you anticipate this large early voting turnout will mean on the election?
Yeah, that's the whole question of, who's going to win, who's going to lose. That's what none of us know. I mean, the early vote numbers have been huge everywhere. And I think it's a combination of interest, and it's a lot of people who are in a pandemic. So I think it's a lot of people not wanting to do it on election day. It's a lot of interest figuring out which is which and how much is, that's what makes it really tough. Because if this interest is indicative of the way the election's going to end up with numbers, that's probably benefits Biden. If it's just people trying to get it out of the way early, and it's not, and who's turning out, so that's hard. That's what everyone's trying to figure out.
It's interesting. I think that one thing they've made early voting easier. They've made it more convenient. Here in our county, we have 5 locations where you can early vote, and you can vote at any of those 5. You don't have to vote at any particular place, which is nice.
It is good, yeah.
And the other thing, I actually had somebody tell me recently, a friend of mine, an old person like me, but he said to me, he said, I'm going to early vote. I always vote on election day, and I like that tradition, but I'm going to early vote this year because it wasn't that he was afraid of standing in line on election day, even with the COVID, but he said, I'm concerned that I might contract the coronavirus and then I wouldn't be able to vote on election day. So I want to go ahead and vote, make sure I get my vote in. So maybe there's been that factor.
I think there is, and I think Tennessee's done a good job of making it convenient, and a lot of people take advantage. And plus, it really does help. It helps the election day workers. It takes more people out of the crowd and more social distancing, even for the ones who want to do it. So it's a good thing to go ahead and get it out of the way.
I think I saw, correct me on this, but I saw a number the other day that said, I want to say 61 million Americans have already early voted nationally.
Yeah, it's an amazing number. Already, several days ago, as many people had voted that voted the entire time early. So everything else that we're doing right now is setting a new record from last time. Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the down ballot elections, not specifically any particular candidates, unless you want to comment on that. But to what extent do you think that the presidential race this year will impact those down ballot races? I mean, historically, that's pretty significant impact. Mm-hmm. Do you think that'll be the case this year as well?
I do. I think these really close Senate, this battle for the Senate, and we have all these very close Senate races across the country.
Including Kentucky, right?
And we're getting those ads, but I think a lot of what will happen in those close Senate races is if the president carries the state, then that party's Senate candidate is probably going to win. That's what I've seen happen in the past. It's usually pretty close in those toss-up races, and I think that's probably what is likely to happen. And it goes back to what I said about media not being able to cover, negative ads anymore. The media's not really out there in enough strength anymore to talk about your congressional races, to talk about your Senate races, your House, your State House, State Senate. And it's a real shame because those, our state government, local governments probably have more influence on our lives than the federal government anyway. But we paint everything by whatever. If we don't like Donald Trump, we vote against the court clerk of the same party, or vice versa. So we've got to figure that out.
And so, in that same vein, the Democrats have been talking a lot about the importance of flipping. I think they need 4 Senate seats to flip the Senate. Do you have a guess on the probability that will happen?
I've seen it at maybe 60-40 that it probably would. I'd say probably 50-50. You've got to figure that Collins is going to lose, most likely, McSally in Arizona, and then Gardner in Colorado. Those are all. I spend part of my time every year in Maine, and so I watch that race a lot. Susan Collins is kind of a Maine's Phil Bredesen. She's a moderate. Bredesen was a moderate Democrat in the Republican state. She's a moderate Republican in the Democratic state, and it's just almost impossible in this polarization to do that. And where the Kavanaugh vote was an awful vote for Bredesen to have to talk about and reminded everybody of why it's important to be partisan, this Barrett vote was just as tough for Collins.
And you think Hick and Looper will win in Colorado?
Yeah, Gardner's, the polling there is pretty one-sided right now. The big races to watch are Tillis and Cunningham. That race has had, I was listening to NPR on the way here, $200 million spent. It set the record. It's just insane. And the guy who was doing the report said his wife had received 46 pieces of direct mail, 90% of them in that race. So, and that one is the one Democrats think will flip it. But the Purdue, the Georgia race with Purdue running for election is within a point or so.
And what about the Kentucky race? I mean, it seems like I've heard that's pretty close too, but Mitch McConnell's pretty strong.
Yeah, I haven't. That's not one on the toss-ups, although she's a solid candidate. Obviously, you're seeing the negative ads that McConnell's running again. Their polling shows it within striking distance probably. But I think Kentucky will probably still be a pretty solid Trump state, and I think that'll help McConnell.
Just so back to the original question, do you think if Trump wins Kentucky, most likely McConnell will win that seat? Yeah. Interesting. So let's talk about the election itself. It seems likely, or at least possible, if not probable, that this election the results could be contested after, that we won't know on November 3rd, or maybe even a few days, or even weeks after. We've had certainly precedents for that in our history. Samuel Tilden versus Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876. Or more recently, George Bush versus Al Gore in 2000. You talked a little bit about that earlier. But if this election is as close as many predict, when do you think we'll actually know the outcome? When will we have a declared U.S. president?
Well, my hope is that nationally everything is as efficient as the state of Tennessee was in August with the mail-in ballots and all that, but I don't think we can expect that to happen. It all depends on how close, and how close is Pennsylvania, and how they've still got several days to get if the ballots have been postmarked. Is how quickly can those mail-in ballots be counted, and the date that everybody's got to have it by is December 14th when the electors meet.
Yeah, that's right. But some states are saying they're going to allow extra time for those mail-in ballots to be received, and others are saying no.
Yeah, it's a state-by-state thing. That's why they keep going to court. If it's really, really close, it's going to take a while. And what's amazing, Florida ended up with only 600 and something votes apart.
Yeah.
Out of roughly 5 or 6 million votes, that number of votes decided the presidency.
And what could be really interesting is if the U.S. Supreme Court does have to get involved in deciding the election, particularly now that the incumbent candidate named three of the 9 are his appointees. That will be.
Yeah, let's hope it doesn't end there.
Yeah, let's.
For the sake of the court, the country, yeah.
So, shifting gears again, the U.S. intelligence community, whom I have a lot of respect for because I was a part of that back in my former career, continues to report that some foreign nations are trying to interfere with or influence the outcome of this presidential election. What's your view on these reports, and how concerned should individual voters be about foreign interference or influence in the elections?
It's been, certainly if it's happening this time, it's been a little more low-key than last time. If you remember too, when I go back to, we were talking about 16 and the way it looks or doesn't look like 20. Hillary Clinton's emails were playing basically the Access Hollywood thing happened to tape on, I believe, the 10th of October. And within a day or so, that big cache of Hillary Clinton's emails was released. So that kind of changed a lot of the subject. I think we're doing a better job of policing social media and trying to look for those things, but you just honestly never know, probably until the assessment after the election, about what was real and what wasn't.
You think, to that end, do you think there'll be any major surprises in the next week between now and, I don't know.
It's 2020, I tell my students, and honestly, and I know many of you teaching and stuff, from the beginning of this year on, I have no idea what's going to happen in the world between my last class of the week and my first class of the next week. And you just don't know.
It's really true.
Yeah.
This has been a year to remember.
Yeah.
So this year, and truthfully, I was not aware of this until my wife, who already early voted. I have not yet, but my wife early voted, and she printed off a ballot, our local ballot that showed all the elections that we get to vote for, and including, which candidly it should have been, but was a surprise for me, that there were 9 candidates running for U.S. president who qualified and are on the ballot, at least here in the state of Tennessee. Trump, Biden, and 7 others.
Right.
One of whom is Kanye West. I thought that was interesting. One of my sons told me, I hope he was joking, that he was going to vote for Kanye West. But nevertheless, to what extent will those 7 other candidates have any impact at all on this election? And what do you anticipate the collective total percentage of the vote that those 7 might get?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it really has some importance to the race, because if you go back to 16, Clinton won, as we know, the popular vote by roughly 3 million. Trump was aided by the fact that there were 2 independents, a libertarian and a social democrat, who got 6%. So that really lowered the bar. We talk about President Trump at 43%. So if somebody else is getting 6, you don't have to get off that mark very much. Yeah. This time, the 2 independent, there's a Green and another Libertarian, and a lot of the polling will throw them all in, they'll throw 2 in, and it hasn't changed a great deal, but they're only getting 2 or 3% right now. So that raises that bar that President Trump's got to hit to get enough votes to actually then get the Electoral College.
So the Green and the Libertarian candidate presumably are on the ballot in all 50 states. What about the other 5 candidates?
I think it's state by state. Yeah, because I didn't, I voted also, but I didn't really look at the others. I didn't know. I knew Kanye was trying in a lot of states. I didn't know if he was on in Tennessee or not.
Yeah.
He wasn't successful in a lot of places. But yeah, every state has different ways, and sometimes the number of names you got, signatures. Sometimes the bar is higher than others.
So we're almost out of time, but we have just a couple of questions left.
All right.
And, I want to just harken back to something you alluded to a minute ago, and that is the coronavirus and the craziness of this year 2020. The coronavirus has disaffected our lives in a number of ways, but also, and importantly relative to this conversation, it disaffected both national conventions, the DNC and the RNC, that were conducted earlier this year. Do you think that the conventions themselves this year being so different, particularly the Democratic National Convention, which was really different, will have any impact on this election? And do you anticipate that we will hopefully, return to more normal conventions in the future?
I think it has, this pandemic has fundamentally changed everything. And I know with the teachers, it was, I don't think we'll ever go fully back to the way we did things before. I had a guest speaker in my class yesterday from Washington. And before, they would come down here, stay a couple of days, come into the classroom. We did it on Zoom. And it's maybe not quite as effective, but it's really still good. And compared to all those things, my Channel 4 stuff right now is broadcasting from the corner of my den. And where it was and the quality of the stuff is getting better. So before, when I would do it, I'd either have to go spend the whole night in the studio, or they would send a reporter and a photographer down, and we would do it. And it was 3 or 4 hours, each way, or well.
Yeah.
And so that has made that a lot more efficient. The conventions are going to be different. These conventions were a lot more about our attention spans. They were in and out and quick, and a lot of different clips, and so it was the way we absorb information.
So we're all becoming more like our students. We have shorter attention
Oh
spans.
God, yeah, we do. We just get they keep getting shorter. But the other end of it, and I was thinking about this question. The other end of it is I went to 4 conventions, and the entire political world for that party, plus all the special interest and everybody else, media converges on one city. And there is something to be said for that face-to-face event. And I think the speech in the hall and stuff. So I think you're going to get back to kind of a combo of, you're going to have all the delegates and all the political world of that candidate, of that party, doing it. And you're also, though, going to have these adjustments of these low attention, these fast, let's make it more interesting, that like the roll call of states.
Yeah.
The roll call of states was so good the way they did it this time versus just going around the convention room. So
It was very interesting the way they did it in their home states.
yeah. So there's going to be a combination there.
That's good. So, I want to, in a minute, I want to ask you if there's anything that I haven't asked you that I should have, i.e. anything you want to share with us. But before I ask you that, I want to ask you, do you have, or are you willing to share with us your prediction on who our president will be in February of 21?
If you trust the polling, let's start there. If you trust that the pollsters are talking to the right people, that they've got things worked out, and I look at oodles of it every day, then you think Joe Biden's going to win. If they are wrong about who's turning out, or again, wrong in Pennsylvania and a couple other places, it could go the other way. 538 has it at an 87% chance that that Biden will win. But, I would put it at maybe 75. But think about it, 75% means 1 out of every 4 times the other Trump's going to win. So that's where I
Was Nate Silver at 538, was he correct in 2016? Do you know? What did he
I don't think so. I remember, one thing I remember about Nate Silver in 16 was he had, at least at this point in time, had Hillary Clinton at a high probability. But he did caution, like I just did.
Yeah.
He said, and I forget which, it was during the baseball, it was during the World Series. I think it was either World Series or playoff, and one of the teams had a 3-1 lead. And he said, now that's about, Trump's chances are about the same probability, because he does sports stuff too, of a team coming back from a 3-1 deficit.
Okay.
You know what happened in that series? The team came back. Yeah. And so then it happened in the election.
Yeah. So both low probability, but both happened.
Both happened. Yeah.
And it could happen again.
Could. Yeah. Don't be surprised me.
So, Mr. Syler, thank you so much. You have shared so much interesting food for thought today. I have really enjoyed talking with you. Is there anything else that you want to share with particularly our virtual audience or the folks that are here in this room that I didn't ask you about, that I should have asked you today?
Yeah, well, I think you covered everything very, very well. And I want to thank Cumberland University and Steve and everyone for putting this together, and for you for giving your time. And it's a real honor to be in this historic room and to be able to talk politics.
It's our privilege to have you today. We thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us. I too want to thank Steve Spann for making this happen. I want to thank Rusty Richardson for kind of choreographing this. And I want to thank all of our students and other members of the Cumberland community who are watching this. And if you haven't already done so, get out and vote. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just looked at that big silver hat before he put it at 71.